A single gunshot echoed across the vast, unforgiving desert of the Arizona Territory, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crisp autumn sky of 1876. Dust billowed from beneath Dakota Young's boots as he urged his Palomino stallion forward, tracking the faint trail of disturbed earth that stretched across the barren landscape. The 29-year-old cowboy pulled his hat lower to shield his eyes from the relentless sun, scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd spent his life in these untamed lands. Dakota had been riding for almost 2 days, tracking a small band of cattle rustlers who had made off with 3 of his best breeding heifers. The trail had led him farther from Clifton than he'd intended to venture, especially with the threat of Apache raids increasing in recent months. But a man's livelihood was worth fighting for in these parts, and Dakota wasn't the type to let thieves profit from his hard work. As he crested a rocky ridge, his keen eyes caught sight of something unusual in the distance, not the rustlers he'd been pursuing, but what appeared to be an abandoned wagon, listing to one side like a wounded animal. Instinct and caution wrestled within him as he approached, his right hand hovering near the Colt revolver strapped to his hip. The wagon had been ransacked, its contents strewn across the ground. Dakota dismounted, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger as he inspected the scene. The tracks told a grim story: multiple horses, riders who knew what they were after, and signs of a struggle. Most concerning was the absence of bodies, which meant the wagon's occupants had either escaped or been taken. A soft sound, barely audible over the desert wind, caught his attention. Dakota's hand moved to his revolver as he circled cautiously around the wagon. There, partially concealed beneath a tattered canvas, lay a woman. She was young, perhaps 25, with hair the color of burnished copper that tumbled in tangled disarray around her dirt-streaked face. Her dress, once fine but now torn and soiled, spoke of a journey that had begun with hope but encountered terrible misfortune. Dakota knelt beside her, noting with relief the steady rise and fall of her chest. "Madam," he called softly, not wanting to startle her, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes of startling clarity, the deep blue-green of mountain lakes he'd seen in his youth. Fear flashed across her face, and she attempted to scramble away, only to collapse with a cry of pain. "Easy now," Dakota said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. Name's Dakota Young. I have a ranch near Clifton." The woman's gaze darted around wildly before settling back on his face, seeming to assess his sincerity. "Katherine," she finally whispered, her voice parched and weak. "Katherine James. What happened here, Miss James?" "Bandits," she managed, wincing as she tried to sit up. "3 days ago, they took everything: our money, supplies, even our horses." Her voice broke. "They killed my uncle. I managed to hide, but my ankle." She gestured weakly toward her right foot, which was swollen and discolored. Dakota frowned, gently examining the injury. "It's bad, but I don't think it's broken. How long have you been out here alone?" "2 nights," she replied, her composure crumbling. "I tried to walk, but I couldn't make it more than a few steps. I thought I was going to die out here." The stark reality of her situation struck Dakota hard. Alone in the desert with no water, food, or shelter, Katherine James had faced almost certain death with remarkable courage. "Can you stand?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to assess her condition. Katherine attempted to rise, determination etched on her face, but collapsed with a gasp of pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, frustration and despair evident in her voice. Dakota made his decision in an instant. "Then I'll carry you until you can," he said simply, the words coming naturally despite their weight. Confusion crossed Katherine's face. "What? No, you can't possibly. I'm not leaving you here, and you can't walk," Dakota interrupted. "My horse can carry us both to the nearest town. From there, we can figure out what to do next." Before she could protest further, Dakota gathered her up in his arms. Though weakened by her ordeal, she wasn't as light as her frame suggested, and he admired the quiet dignity with which she accepted his help despite her obvious discomfort at being so vulnerable. "My uncle," Katherine said as Dakota carried her toward his horse. I couldn't bury him." They dragged him away. Dakota paused, understanding the burden she carried. "I'll come back and look for him," he promised. "Give him a proper burial, but right now we need to get you to safety." After settling Katherine on his palomino and gathering what few useful items remained from the wagon, Dakota mounted behind her. She sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the proximity to a stranger, but as exhaustion overcame her, she gradually relaxed against his chest. "The nearest town is Silver Creek," Dakota told her as they set off. "It's about 4 hours' ride. Think you can make it that far?" Katherine nodded, her determination evident despite her weakened state. "I've made it this far, Mr. Young. I won't falter now." As they rode, the sun began its descent, painting the desert in hues of gold and amber. Dakota kept a vigilant watch on their surroundings, aware that the bandits who had attacked Katherine's wagon might still be in the area. The woman in his arms remained mostly silent, though occasionally she would shudder with what he suspected were suppressed tears. "You're from back east," Dakota observed, hoping conversation might distract her from her pain and grief. "Boston," Katherine confirmed. "My uncle and I were traveling to California. He had purchased land near Sacramento, was planning to establish a vineyard." Her voice caught. "He was the only family I had left after my parents died last winter." Dakota's arms tightened slightly around her, a gesture of comfort he hadn't consciously intended. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss James." "What will become of me now?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Dakota had no ready answer. A proper lady from Boston had few options in the rough mining town of Silver Creek. The West was unforgiving to those unprepared for its harshness, and Katherine James was now adrift in a world utterly foreign to her. "First, we get you to a doctor," he said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." By the time they reached Silver Creek, Katherine had fallen into an uneasy sleep against Dakota's chest. The small town was alive with evening activity, miners and cowboys crowding the saloon, shopkeepers closing up for the night, and a few respectable townsfolk hurrying home before darkness fully descended. Dakota rode directly to Doc Miller's small house at the edge of town. The elderly physician answered his door with a scowl that quickly transformed to concern when he saw the unconscious woman in Dakota's arms. "Bring her in," Doc Miller instructed, clearing books from a worn examination table. "What happened?" Dakota explained as he gently laid Katherine down, noting with concern how pale she had become during their journey. "Bandits attacked her wagon 3 days ago, killed her uncle. She's been out there alone, injured." Doc Miller nodded grimly as he examined Katherine's ankle. "Nasty sprain, but not broken. She's suffering from exposure and dehydration, though. She'll need rest, food, and careful attention." He glanced up at Dakota. "You planning to take responsibility for her, Young? Town's no place for an unaccompanied lady, especially one in her condition." The question gave Dakota pause. He'd intended only to bring Katherine to safety, not to entangle himself further in her predicament. Yet looking at her now, vulnerable and alone in a harsh land she didn't understand, he found he couldn't simply walk away. "For now," he answered. "At least until she's well enough to decide what she wants to do." The doctor raised an eyebrow but nodded. "She can stay here tonight. I'll have my wife look after her, but she'll need somewhere to go tomorrow." "I'll speak with Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house," Dakota said. When Katherine awoke the following morning, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, her ankle bandaged and her body clean of the desert dust. A kindly older woman introduced herself as Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife, and explained that Dakota Young had brought her to Silver Creek the previous evening. "Where is Mr. Young now?" Katherine asked, trying to mask her anxiety at being alone among strangers. "He went to make arrangements for you at the boarding house, Mrs. Miller replied, helping Katherine sit up and offering her a bowl of broth. He's a good man, Dakota Young, one of the few true gentlemen in these parts despite his rough exterior. Katherine sipped the broth, her mind working through her limited options. She had no money, no family, and no prospects. The land her uncle had purchased was hundreds of miles away, and she had no way to prove her claim to it without the papers that had been stolen. "What kind of town is Silver Creek?" she asked. Mrs. Miller's expression grew guarded. "It's a mining town, dear. Not the sort of place for a lady without protection. There are good people here, mind you, but they're outnumbered by those who, well, let's just say virtue isn't prized highly by all." The door opened before Katherine could respond, and Dakota entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Something in Katherine's chest tightened at the sight of him, this stranger who had saved her life and now bore the burden of her welfare. "Miss James," he greeted her, his deep voice somehow reassuring. "Glad to see you awake. How's the ankle?" "Better, thank you," Katherine replied. "Mr. Young, I don't know how to repay your kindness, but please know I have every intention of doing so once I'm able." Dakota shifted uncomfortably. "No repayment necessary. I've spoken with Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house. She has a room for you, but—" He hesitated. "But what? It's not free," he admitted, "and she'll expect payment in advance." Katherine's heart sank. "I see. And I assume there's no bank in town where I might wire for funds." She knew even before he shook his head that such an amenity was unlikely in a frontier mining town. "Miss James, I've given this some thought," Dakota said, his expression earnest. "I have a proposition for you, though I understand if you find it inappropriate." Katherine tensed, immediately wary. She had heard stories of women in desperate circumstances being offered propositions that no respectable lady could accept. Seeing her reaction, Dakota quickly continued, "My ranch is about 10 miles outside of town. It's modest, but I have a small cabin that my former foreman used before he moved on last spring. It's separate from the main house and would provide you with privacy and safety while you recover and decide on your next steps." Katherine studied him, searching for any hint of impropriety in his offer. Finding none, she asked, "And what would you expect in return, Mr. Young?" "My housekeeper, Mrs. Garza, is getting on in years. She could use help with the cooking and household accounts," Dakota replied. "Once your ankle heals, of course. In the meantime, you'd have a safe place to stay and time to consider your options." It was an unexpectedly generous offer, but Katherine was hesitant to place herself further in this stranger's debt. "You know nothing about me, Mr. Young." A small smile touched his lips. "I know you survived 3 days alone in the desert after watching your uncle murdered. That tells me you're strong, resourceful, and have extraordinary courage. Those are qualities I admire, Miss James." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since the bandit's attack. "Very well," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Young, with gratitude. But only until I can secure proper employment or determine how to reach California." Dakota nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Doc says you should stay off that ankle for at least 3 more days. I'll come back for you on Sunday morning if that's acceptable." After Dakota left, Katherine found herself subject to a stern lecture from Mrs. Miller about the impropriety of a young, unmarried woman living on a bachelor's ranch, even with the presence of a housekeeper. But the doctor's wife grudgingly admitted that Dakota Young was known for his honor, and that the alternative remaining in Silver Creek with no money and no protector was far more dangerous. 3 days later, true to his word, Dakota returned with a wagon outfitted with blankets and pillows to make Katherine comfortable for the journey. The doctor provided her with a sturdy walking stick and strict instructions to continue resting her ankle for another week. The ride to Dakota's ranch revealed a landscape beautiful in its stark simplicity. The desert gave way to grassy plains, and in the distance, mountains rose like sentinels against the sky. Katherine, dressed in a simple calico gown provided by Mrs. Miller, found herself studying her rescuer as he guided the horses with capable hands. Dakota Young was not what one would call conventionally handsome, but there was a strength and integrity to his features that Katherine found compelling. His face was weathered from years under the desert sun, with laugh lines around eyes that missed nothing. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and direct. "Tell me about your ranch, Mr. Young," Katherine prompted as they traveled. "How long have you been in Arizona Territory?" 5 years, he replied. "Came west after the war between the states. Worked cattle drives up from Texas until I saved enough to buy my own place." He glanced at her. "It's not much compared to what you're probably used to, but it's good land." "And your family, are they nearby?" A shadow crossed his face. "Lost my parents to cholera when I was 14. No siblings. The ranch hands and Mrs. Garza are the closest thing to family I have now." Katherine nodded, understanding his solitude all too well. "The war you fought." "Union cavalry," Dakota confirmed. "But that's a lifetime ago now." They fell into a comfortable silence until the ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house with several outbuildings, corrals, and a small bunkhouse where, Dakota explained, his 3 ranch hands lived. Beyond the immediate buildings stretched acres of grazing land where cattle roamed under the watchful eye of a cowboy on horseback. The foreman's cabin was indeed small but clean and functional, with a bedroom, a tiny sitting area, and a cast-iron stove for cooking and heat. Mrs. Garza, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair and the dignified bearing of Mexican aristocracy, had prepared the cabin for Katherine's arrival, stocking it with basic provisions and adding touches like wildflowers in a tin cup on the table. Mrs. Garza doesn't speak much English, Dakota explained, but she understands more than she lets on. She'll help you settle in. Katherine was touched by the consideration shown in preparing for her arrival. "Thank you, Mr. Young. This is more than generous." Dakota seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll leave you to rest. Mrs. Garza will bring dinner later. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, she can show you around the main house." That evening, as Katherine sat on the small porch of her cabin watching the sunset paint the landscape in fiery hues, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been journeying to a new life in California with her uncle, full of hopes and plans. Now he was dead, and she was dependent on the charity of a stranger whose quiet strength had become her only anchor in a world turned upside down. Despite her uncertainty about the future, Katherine found herself feeling something she hadn't expected, a tentative sense of peace. Dakota Young had asked nothing of her that compromised her dignity, and for the first time since the bandits' attack, she felt safe. The days that followed established a routine that brought structure to Katherine's life. As her ankle healed, she began assisting Mrs. Garza with household tasks, starting with mending and simple food preparation that could be done while seated. The older woman was initially reserved, regarding Katherine with suspicious eyes, but gradually thawed as Katherine demonstrated both competence and a willingness to learn. Dakota himself was often absent during daylight hours, attending to the demands of running a cattle ranch. But in the evenings, he would sometimes stop by Katherine's cabin to check on her progress or invite her to join him for dinner at the main house. These meals were typically quiet affairs, with Dakota asking polite questions about her recovery and Katherine inquiring about the day's work on the ranch. 2 weeks after her arrival, Katherine ventured to the main house without her walking stick for the first time. She found Dakota in his study, frowning over a ledger book with obvious frustration. "Is something wrong, Mr. Young?" she asked from the doorway. Dakota looked up, surprise giving way to a smile that transformed his serious face. "Miss James, you're walking without assistance." "That's excellent progress." "Thank you," she replied. "Mrs. Garza is resting, and I thought I might prepare dinner tonight. Is there anything in particular you'd like?" Dakota hesitated, then gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Actually, if you have a moment, I could use your help with something else first." Curious, Katherine seated herself and was surprised when Dakota turned the ledger toward her. "I've never been much for numbers," he admitted. "Usually my foreman handled the accounts, but since he left, I've been struggling to keep everything straight. Mrs. Garza mentioned you have a head for figures." Katherine examined the ledger, quickly identifying several calculation errors. "I was responsible for my father's household accounts in Boston," she explained as she made corrections. "He was a professor of literature, brilliant with words but hopeless with numbers." For the next hour, Katherine organized Dakota's chaotic bookkeeping system, explaining her methods as she worked. She was surprised by how attentively he listened, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine appreciation for her expertise. "You're a godsend, Miss James," Dakota declared when they finished. "Would you consider taking over the ranch accounts? I'd pay you a fair wage, of course. It would be proper employment, not charity." The offer was tempting a way to earn her keep while maintaining her dignity. "I'd be happy to help," Katherine agreed. "Though I must insist the arrangement remain temporary, I still intend to determine whether I can claim my uncle's property in California." A flicker of something disappointment crossed Dakota's face before he nodded. "Of course." "Shall we say $3 a week? That's what I paid my foreman for the bookkeeping portion of his duties." It was a generous wage by any standard, and Katherine accepted gratefully. As they walked to the kitchen together to prepare dinner, she felt a shift in their relationship from rescuer and rescued to something closer to partnership. That evening, as they shared a meal Katherine had prepared, Dakota seemed more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He spoke of his plans for the ranch, his hopes to expand his herd, and the challenges of ranching in a territory still struggling toward statehood. "Why cattle ranching?" Katherine asked. "You mentioned you were in the cavalry during the war." "Many former soldiers seem to prefer town life after experiencing battle." Dakota considered her question, his expression thoughtful. "After seeing so much death and destruction, I wanted to build something instead, create life instead of taking it." He gestured toward the window where the last light of day illuminated his land. "And out here, there's a freedom that's hard to find elsewhere, room to breathe, room to forget." "What are you trying to forget, Mr. Young?" The question slipped out before Katherine could reconsider its propriety. Dakota's eyes met hers, and for a moment she glimpsed the shadows that haunted him. "The same things we all try to forget, Miss James, the moments when we failed those who depended on us." The raw honesty of his answer created an intimacy between them that both thrilled and frightened Katherine. She found herself wanting to comfort this strong, solitary man, to assure him that whatever burdens he carried, he need not bear them alone. Instead, she said simply, "I think we all carry such regrets, Mr. Young. The trick is learning to live with them without allowing them to define us." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed between them. A connection had formed, fragile but undeniable, based on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss. Over the following weeks, Katherine found herself settling into life at the Young ranch with unexpected ease. Her work on the accounts expanded to include correspondence with cattle buyers and supply merchants, tasks Dakota was grateful to relinquish. With her ankle fully healed, she also took over much of the cooking, discovering to her surprise that she enjoyed creating meals that brought appreciation to Dakota's usually serious face. Mrs. Garza, initially wary of Katherine's presence, gradually became an ally, teaching her the skills needed for frontier housekeeping, from preserving food to making soap and candles. Though their verbal communication remained limited, a genuine affection developed between the two women. The three-ranch hands Emmett, a grizzled veteran of countless cattle drives, Joe, a young cowboy with dreams of his own spread someday, and Carlos, Mrs. Garza's nephew, were respectful but distant at first. However, as Katherine proved herself useful and unpretentious, they too accepted her presence, even occasionally joining her and Dakota for Sunday dinners. Katherine wrote to the land office in Sacramento regarding her uncle's property, but weeks passed with no response. She tried not to dwell on the uncertainty of her future, focusing instead on the daily rhythms of ranch life. Yet each night, alone in her cabin, she found herself thinking not of California but of Dakota Young, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, and the rare but transformative smile that seemed reserved only for her. For his part, Dakota found himself inventing reasons to seek Katherine's company. He brought her wildflowers he'd spotted while riding the range, claiming Mrs. Garza had mentioned she might want them for dyes. He asked her opinion on business matters that he was perfectly capable of deciding himself. He lingered over evening meals, reluctant to return to the solitude that had once been his refuge but now felt strangely empty. Autumn deepened, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of winter. Dakota began preparations for the harsher weather ahead, ensuring adequate supplies and securing buildings against the coming cold. Katherine helped where she could, learning to adapt to the rhythms of ranch life with a grace that impressed even Mrs. Garza. One crisp October evening, Dakota returned from Clifton with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This came for you," he told Katherine, handing her the parcel with an unreadable expression. "From the land office in Sacramento." Katherine's heart raced as she opened the letter accompanying a set of legal documents. Her eyes scanned the formal text, emotions warring within her as she absorbed the contents. "My uncle's claim has been validated," she said softly. "The land is legally mine if I can reach Sacramento and sign the final paperwork before the end of the year." Dakota's face remained carefully neutral. "That's excellent news. You must be relieved to have your future secured." Katherine nodded, though relief was far from the dominant emotion swirling inside her. "Yes, it's what I've been waiting for." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with words neither seemed able to speak. "Winter's coming," Dakota finally said. "Travel will be difficult soon. If you intend to reach California before the mountain passes close, you should make arrangements promptly." "Yes, of course," Katherine agreed, though the thought of leaving filled her with a sense of loss she hadn't anticipated. Dakota hesitated, then added, "The next stage west leaves Clifton in 3 days. I'll take you to town if that's what you decide." "Thank you," Katherine managed, clutching the documents that represented her independence, a goal that had somehow become less appealing than it once was. That night, Katherine barely slept, her mind consumed with indecision. The California property offered security and the fulfillment of her uncle's dreams. It was what she had planned for, what she had survived for. Yet the thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Dakota, created an ache in her chest that no rational argument could soothe. By morning, Katherine had reached no resolution. She went through her daily tasks mechanically, her distraction noted but not commented on by Mrs. Garza. Dakota had ridden out at dawn to check on cattle in the north pasture and wasn't expected back until evening, leaving Katherine to wrestle with her thoughts alone. Late that afternoon, as Katherine was returning to her cabin after helping Mrs. Garza prepare dinner, the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Expecting Dakota, she was surprised to see Emmett riding hard toward the main house, another rider slumped in the saddle behind him. "Miss James," Emmett called, his voice urgent, "get Mrs. Garza and prepare the boss's room." "Dakota's been shot." Katherine's world narrowed to a single focal point as Emmett and Carlos carried Dakota's unconscious form into the house. Blood soaked his left side, his face ashen beneath its tan. "What happened?" she demanded, already tearing sheets for bandages as Mrs. Garza boiled water. "Rustlers," Emmett explained grimly. "Boss caught them trying to drive off a dozen head. There was a shootout. He got one of them but took a bullet before the others fled." Katherine's hands trembled as she cut away Dakota's blood-soaked shirt, revealing a wound just below his ribs. "We need the doctor," she said, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Joe's already riding for Clifton," Emmett assured her, But it's a 2-hour journey each way, assuming Doc Miller is even in town. Then we'll have to do what we can, Katherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. The next hours passed in a blur of blood and fear as she and Mrs. Garza cleaned the wound, extracted the bullet using tweezers sterilized in a flame, and stitched the ragged flesh with careful, precise sutures. Throughout the ordeal, Dakota remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Katherine refused to leave his side, bathing his fevered brow and monitoring his pulse with a vigilance born of terror that she might lose him before she could tell him what she had only just admitted to herself, that somewhere between the desert rescue and this moment, she had fallen in love with Dakota Young. Doc Miller arrived shortly before midnight, examining their handiwork with grudging approval. "You've done well," he told Katherine. "The bullet missed any vital organs and your stitching is neater than most physicians I know. He's young and strong. With proper care, he should recover." "I'll care for him," Katherine said, her tone brooking no argument. For 3 days and nights, Katherine barely left Dakota's bedside. She spooned broth between his lips, changed his bandages, and spoke to him in soft tones, unsure whether he could hear her but unwilling to remain silent. Mrs. Garza brought food that Katherine barely touched and watched with knowing eyes as the Boston lady tended the rancher with a devotion that transcended mere duty. On the 4th morning, Katherine had just dozed off in the chair beside Dakota's bed when a hoarse voice pulled her from slumber. "You're still here." Katherine's eyes flew open to find Dakota watching her, his gaze weak but lucid. Relief flooded through her as she reached for his hand. "Of course I'm still here. Where else would I be?" "California," he murmured. "Your land." "Hush," Katherine said, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "That can wait. You need to focus on healing." A ghost of his rare smile touched Dakota's lips. "You saved my life." "I believe we're even on that count now, Mr. Young," Katherine replied, her own smile tremulous with emotion. Dakota's fingers weakly squeezed hers. "Dakota," he corrected. "After pulling a bullet from my side, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." "Dakota," Katherine repeated softly, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. "Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger." In the days that followed, Dakota's recovery progressed steadily. Katherine continued as his primary caretaker, helping him sit up, changing his bandages, and eventually supporting his first tentative steps around the room. Their conversations, once limited to ranch business and polite inquiries, deepened as Dakota's strength returned, touching on childhood memories, hopes for the future, and the experiences that had shaped them. "Why didn't you leave for California?" Dakota asked one evening as they shared a quiet dinner in his room, his first solid meal since the shooting. "The stage you mentioned has come and gone twice now." Katherine carefully set down her fork, gathering courage for the truth she had been avoiding. "I couldn't leave," she said simply. "Not with you injured. Not with so much left unsaid between us." Dakota's eyes, more expressive than she had ever seen them, searched her face. "And what is it that's unsaid, Katherine?" The use of her given name, rare until now, sent a shiver through her. "That I have come to care for you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That the thought of leaving this place, leaving you, brings me more pain than I can bear to contemplate." Dakota was silent for so long that Katherine feared she had misread everything between them. Then with effort he reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been alone most of my life," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "Convinced myself I preferred it that way, then you came and suddenly solitude felt like punishment instead of peace." His fingers tightened around hers. "I don't want you to go, Katherine, but I won't keep you from the future you planned, the security you deserve." "Plans change," Katherine said softly. "I came west seeking a new beginning. Perhaps I've found it, just not where I expected." The declaration hung between them, heavy with possibility, until Dakota slowly drew her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I'm not a wealthy man," he warned. "This ranch is everything I have." "I don't need wealth," Katherine assured him. "I need purpose, connection. A place where I'm valued for more than my marriageability or family connections." She met his gaze steadily. "I need you, Dakota Young. The rest is just details." The weeks that followed saw Dakota's strength return and the relationship between him and Katherine deepen into something neither had dared hope for. They moved cautiously, both aware of the impropriety of their situation despite the chaperonage provided by Mrs. Garza's watchful presence. But the connection between them was undeniable, growing stronger with each shared conversation, each lingering glance, each moment of unexpected laughter. By December, Dakota was well enough to resume most of his duties, though Katherine insisted he continue delegating the more strenuous tasks to the ranch hands. The deadline for claiming her California property loomed, requiring a decision Katherine had already made in her heart but needed to formalize. On a clear winter morning, Dakota asked Katherine to ride with him to a ridge overlooking the ranch. Though the air was crisp, the sun provided enough warmth to make the outing pleasant. They rode in comfortable silence until they reached the promontory, where Dakota helped Katherine dismount. "I wanted to show you something," he said, guiding her to the edge where the view stretched for miles in every direction. Katherine gasped at the panorama before her, the ranch buildings below, the cattle grazing in distant pastures, the mountains rising majestically on the horizon, all bathed in golden winter light. "It's breathtaking," she murmured. "This is where I decided to build my life," Dakota told her, his voice quiet but intense. "I stood here 5 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few dollars in my pocket, and I knew this was where I belonged." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Katherine, I know you have options beyond this place. The land in California offers advantages this hardscrabble ranch can't match, but I can't let you go without telling you what's in my heart." Katherine's pulse quickened as Dakota dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "I love you, Katherine James," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since I found you in the desert, fighting to survive against impossible odds. You've brought light and purpose to my life in ways I never imagined possible. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Of building a future here together, tears sprang to Katherine's eyes, not of sadness but overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Dakota Young, I will marry you." Dakota rose, drawing her into an embrace that communicated everything words could not: his love, his gratitude, his promise to cherish her always. When their lips met for the first time, Katherine felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment, this man, this love that had found her when she least expected it. "What about California?" Dakota asked as they finally drew apart. "The land, I've already written to the land office," Katherine interrupted. "I've arranged for the property to be sold with the proceeds to be sent here. We can use the money to expand the ranch if you wish, or save it for the future. Our future." Dakota's smile held a wonder that made Katherine's heart soar. "Our future," he repeated, the words a vow and a benediction. They married 2 weeks later in the small church in Clifton with Mrs. Garza, the ranch hands, and a few townsfolk as witnesses. Katherine wore a dress of blue calico, simple but elegant, with wildflowers in her hair. Dakota, clean-shaven and dressed in his best suit, looked at her with such adoration that the minister remarked later he'd never seen a groom more clearly in love. Their wedding night, spent in the main house that was now truly their home, was a discovery of tenderness neither had known existed. Dakota's reverent touches and whispered endearments revealed a passionate nature carefully controlled until now. Katherine, initially shy but emboldened by love, found in her husband's arms a belonging that transcended physical desire, though that aspect of their union proved more rewarding than her limited education on such matters had led her to expect. As winter gave way to spring, the young ranch flourished under the care of its expanded family. The proceeds from the California property allowed Dakota to purchase additional breeding stock and hire 2 more hands, while Katherine established a vegetable garden that promised to reduce their dependence on supplies from town. Mrs. Garza, far from resenting Katherine's permanent place in the household, seemed relieved to share her responsibilities and delighted in teaching her young mistress the traditions of her Mexican heritage. Under her guidance, Katherine learned to make tortillas from scratch, prepare hearty stews that could feed a hard-working crew, and even speak enough Spanish to converse with Carlos and the other Mexican workers who occasionally helped during busy seasons. The first anniversary of their meeting the day Dakota had found Katherine too weak to walk and promised to carry her, until she could was commemorated with a special dinner attended by the entire ranch household. As they shared food, stories, and laughter, Dakota raised his glass in a toast. "To finding strength in unexpected places," he said, his eyes meeting Katherine's with a depth of emotion that still took her breath away. "And to journeys that lead us exactly where we need to be, even when it's not where we intended to go." Later that night, as they lay in each other's arms, Katherine shared the news she'd been saving for this special day. "I visited Doc Miller when we were in town yesterday," she said, watching Dakota's face carefully. "He confirmed what I've suspected for several weeks now. We're going to have a child, Dakota, in about 7 months' time." Dakota's expression transformed from surprise to wonder to joy in the span of heartbeats. "A child," he whispered, placing his hand reverently on Katherine's still flat stomach. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Katherine asked, though his reaction left little doubt. Dakota gathered her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. "More than I can express," he assured her. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own. You've given me more happiness than I ever believed possible, Katherine Young." The months that followed were filled with preparations a nursery added to their home, tiny garments sewn by Katherine and Mrs. Garza, and endless discussions of names and hopes for their child's future. Dakota became even more protective of his wife, insisting she rest frequently and delegate more tasks, though Katherine gently reminded him that generations of women had managed households while expecting. Their son, Daniel James Young, was born on a crisp November morning after a labor that tested Katherine's endurance but could not defeat her determination. Dakota, who had paced outside their bedroom through the night, was summoned by Mrs. Garza just in time to hear his son's first lusty cry. "You have a strong, healthy boy," the older woman announced, ushering the overwhelmed new father into the room. Dakota approached the bed where Katherine lay, exhausted but radiant, their swaddled infant cradled in her arms. "Look what we've created," she whispered as Dakota sat beside her, awe evident in his every movement as he reached out to touch his son's tiny hand. "He's perfect," Dakota declared, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mother." As Dakota gently took his son into his arms for the first time, Katherine was struck by how far they had come from that day in the desert, from strangers bound by circumstance to partners bound by choice, now connected forever through the new life they had created together. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Dakota handling the cattle operations while Katherine oversaw the finances and household. Daniel was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, Michael, completing their family. Dakota's reputation as a fair employer and honest businessman grew throughout the territory, leading to his appointment to the Territorial Council. Katherine, meanwhile, established a small school on their property, teaching not only their own children but those of their workers and neighboring ranchers. Mrs. Garza remained with them until her peaceful passing at the age of 78, by which time she had become more grandmother than employee to the young children. She was buried on a hillside overlooking the ranch, her grave marked by a cross carved by Dakota and adorned with wildflowers during every blooming season. As their children grew, Katherine and Dakota made a point of sharing the story of how they met of a wounded woman found in the desert and the cowboy who promised to carry her until she could walk again. The tale became family legend, a reminder that love often comes when least expected but most needed. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dakota surprised Katherine by taking her back to the ridge where he had proposed. Though his hair now showed streaks of silver and lines of experience marked both their faces, the love between them had only deepened with time. "Do you ever regret it?" Dakota asked as they stood arm in arm, watching the sun set over the land they had nurtured together. "Choosing this life instead of California? The hardships, the isolation, the endless work." Katherine turned to him, her eyes reflecting the same devotion they had shown on their wedding day. "Not for a single moment," she answered truthfully. "This life, our life, has given me everything I never knew I wanted: purpose, family, love beyond measure." She touched his cheek gently. "You carried me when I couldn't walk, Dakota Young, and in doing so, you showed me how to soar." Dakota drew her into his embrace, his kiss as tender as their first yet rich with the history they had written together. "And you, Katherine Young, taught me that the greatest strength lies not in standing alone, but in choosing to stand together." As twilight deepened around them, they made their way back to the home they had built, not just the physical structure of wood and stone, but the bonds of family and community that had grown from one act of compassion in the unforgiving desert. Their journey had begun with a rescue, transformed through love, and continued through a life that, while not without difficulties, was filled with meaning, purpose, and the enduring connection of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become their best selves. In the decades that followed, as their children grew to adulthood and began families of their own, Dakota and Katherine remained the heart of the sprawling ranch that had become a landmark in the region. Daniel, their eldest, eventually took over the daily management of the cattle operation, while Elizabeth established a successful horse breeding program that became renowned throughout the Southwest. Michael, the youngest, surprised them by studying law and returning to help establish Clifton's first proper legal practice, though he remained deeply connected to the ranch that had shaped his character. Through it all, Dakota and Katherine's partnership remained the foundation upon which everything else was built, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that love found in the wilderness can grow to nourish generations.